The hallway was silent except for the faint, rhythmic hum of the fluorescent lights above. It was 5:59 a.m. in Huntsville Unit, Texas, and in exactly 1 minute, the heavy steel door at the end of the corridor would swing open for the last time in one man's life. Inside a tiny cell, 46-year-old Raymond Harris sat on the edge of his narrow bed, his wrists cuffed loosely in front of him. He stared at the floor as if trying to memorize every crack in the concrete. A chaplain stood quietly by the door, holding a small leather Bible, whispering a prayer he had said hundreds of times before. "Raymond," a guard's voice echoed, "it's time." The man didn't flinch. He had known this moment was coming for 18 years since the night that had sealed his fate. But even with all that time, no one is ever truly ready for the walk they call the last mile. The door clanked open. 2 officers stepped inside. One gently took Raymond by the arm. He stood slowly, glancing around the small space that had been his world for nearly 2 decades. A faded calendar still hung on the wall. A tiny radio sat on a shelf, silent now. On his bed lay the folded prison uniform he would never wear again. They led him into the hallway, long, sterile, and lined with locked doors identical to the one he was leaving behind. As he walked, other inmates pressed against their small window slots. Some nodded in silence. Some whispered prayers. A few turned away, unable to watch. For most of America, Execution Day is an idea, a headline on the evening news, a debate on talk shows. But inside death row, it's not an idea. It's real. It's the quiet ticking of a clock that everyone hears but no one talks about. It's the calendar date scratched on the back of a metal bunk. It's the weight that sits on a man's chest every single day, knowing that one of those days will be his last. As Raymond reached the final turn in the corridor, he stopped for just a moment and looked back. "Tell my mama I'm sorry," he murmured. Then he faced forward again and continued down the hall, toward a door no one ever returns through. This is death row, the most secretive, most misunderstood corner of the American justice system. And this is what life inside it is really like. It begins long before the execution chamber. Before the final meal. Before the last walk. It begins the moment the sentence is read. In 2005, a man named James McAllister sat in a courtroom in Florida, trembling as the judge read the words that would define the rest of his life. "The sentence of this court is that you be put to death by lethal injection." The room fell silent. James stared at the floor. He was 27 years old. Minutes later, he was placed in handcuffs and led out of the courthouse. Reporters shouted questions. Family members wept. And James, like hundreds before him, entered a world that few people on the outside truly understand. Death row isn't like the rest of prison. It's a place of total isolation. Inmates spend an average of 22 to 23 hours a day alone in a small cell, usually no larger than a parking space. The walls are bare concrete. The bed is a slab with a thin mattress. There's a stainless steel toilet and sink, a narrow shelf, and a small slit of a window, often too high to see out of. Time here doesn't move like it does in the outside world. Days blend into weeks, weeks into years. Inmates wake at dawn to the sound of metal doors unlocking. Breakfast arrives through a slot in the door. Most days, there's no conversation, no human touch, no sight of the sky. "I talk to the walls," James once wrote in a letter. "Sometimes I swear they talk back." For many, the loneliness is the hardest part. Psychologists call it death row syndrome. It's a mix of anxiety, depression, and hopelessness that builds over years of isolation and the looming certainty of death. Some inmates write letters to pen pals or talk to themselves just to hear a voice. Others retreat completely inward, speaking to no one for months at a time. Yet, amid that crushing silence, rituals form. Inmates count the number of steps from one end of their cell to the other. They memorize every sound, the clank of the food cart, the squeak of boots on the tier. They mark days on calendars or scratch lines into the wall. And every day, without fail, they watch the light change through that tiny slit of a window, the closest most of them will ever get to the outside world again. Once a day, if they're lucky, they're allowed 1 hour outside, but outside is often a small, caged yard, not much bigger than a living room, enclosed by high concrete walls topped with razor wire. There's no view of the sky. No grass. No horizon. Just open air and space to pace. Still, many treasure that hour. It's the only time they can feel the sun on their skin. Meals are simple and predictable, often the same rotation of beans, rice, and cornbread. Mail is heavily screened. Visits are rare, and when they happen, they are separated by thick glass and a telephone handset. Some inmates form bonds with guards. Others never speak a word to them. Guards, 2. Feel the weight of the row. Many say they try not to learn too much about the men they watch over. It's easier that way when the day of execution finally comes. But even here, hope flickers. Appeals can stretch for decades. Some inmates spend over 20 years waiting for an execution date. A few see their sentences overturned. Others die of natural causes before the state ever carries out the punishment. And then there are the nights like Raymond's, the ones where the phone on the warden's desk might ring at the last moment. A stay of execution. A new hearing. A miracle. Those nights, the entire unit holds its breath. One guard described it like this: "It's the strangest feeling in the world. Everyone knows someone might die tonight, and no one knows if the phone is going to ring." But not everyone gets that call. And for those who don't, the final 24 hours are unlike anything else in the world. It begins with the death watch. Guards move the inmate to a special cell next to the execution chamber. They are monitored around the clock. They are offered a final meal, anything they want within reason. They are allowed a final phone call, a final letter, a final visit. Most choose something simple to eat. A burger. Fried chicken. A piece of pie. Some refuse food altogether. And then, as the clock ticks closer to midnight, the reality of the sentence becomes impossible to ignore. Some pray. Some cry. Some sit in silence. And some, like Raymond Harris, stare at the wall, waiting for the sound of footsteps that will come for them soon enough. What happens next, the final walk, the last words, and the moment the state carries out the ultimate punishment, is unlike anything most Americans will ever witness. And for those still on death row, it is the shadow that follows them every second of every day. But what happens after the execution? How do guards, wardens, and even other inmates cope with what they've just seen? And how do some condemned men spend their final hours defying everything we think we know about justice and punishment? The answers may shock you. The door clanged shut behind Raymond Harris as he entered the death watch cell, a small, sterile room just steps away from the execution chamber. It was now 6:07 a.m. The clock on the wall ticked quietly, each second bringing him closer to 6 p.m., the time scheduled for his execution. From this point on, nothing about his life was normal. Every movement, every word, every breath was watched closely by a rotation of correctional officers assigned to death watch duty. They worked in pairs, never taking their eyes off him. Even the simplest actions, a glass of water, a bathroom break, were monitored and documented. This final 24 hours is unlike any other day on death row. It is a ritual, one that has been repeated hundreds of times in prisons across America, in Texas, Florida, Georgia, and beyond. It is carefully choreographed, deeply procedural, and yet deeply human. The first part is the final meal. Around midday, Raymond was given a form where he could request anything he wanted within the prison's budget, usually around $20. He wrote slowly and deliberately: fried chicken, mashed potatoes, sweet tea, and pecan pie. Some inmates go extravagant: steak, shrimp, barbecue. Others request childhood favorites like peanut butter sandwiches or pizza. A few refuse food altogether, saying they've lost their appetite for life. In Florida's Union Correctional Institution, one warden remembered a man who asked only for a single black olive. When asked why, he replied, "I want to plant it in the ground when I'm gone." As Raymond ate in silence, a chaplain sat nearby, reading softly from the Psalms. Across the hall, officers checked and rechecked the gurney in the execution chamber. A team of technicians prepared the 4 lines. A warden reviewed the paperwork for the final time. Every signature, every box ticked, every phone number confirmed. Because even now, a single phone call could change everything. It's called the death house phone. It sits on the warden's desk in plain sight. If it rings, it means the governor or a court has issued a stay of execution. That phone has rung before, sometimes minutes before the scheduled time. And when it does, the entire machine grinds to a halt. But most nights, the phone stays silent. By early afternoon, Raymond's final visitors arrived, his younger sister, Maria, and his mother, now in a wheelchair. They had 30 minutes through a glass partition, speaking through phones. Tears streamed down Maria's face as she pressed her hand against the glass. Raymond mirrored the gesture from the other side. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "For everything." Visits like these are some of the most painful moments on death row. Families who have waited decades for closure see their loved ones one last time. Guards who've known these inmates for years watch the scene quietly, trying not to show emotion. Even other inmates fall silent. Some condemned men spend their final hours writing letters, to victims' families, to their own children, to people they will never meet. Others choose to remain silent, alone with their thoughts. One man in Florida spent his final hour singing hymns so loudly they echoed through the entire wing. Another refused to speak at all, sitting motionless in the corner until officers came for him. Raymond chose to write. On a sheet of lined paper, he penned a short message. To anyone I've hurt, I hope you find peace. I was a broken man. Maybe now, I'll find peace too. At 5:45 p.m., the final preparations began. 2 officers entered the cell. Raymond stood without being asked. He was calm, calmer than anyone else in the room. They placed soft leather restraints around his wrists and escorted him into the narrow hallway known as the last mile. Each step echoed through the corridor. On the other side of the wall, reporters from local and national news outlets were already gathering. In a separate room, relatives of his victims sat behind one-way glass, waiting to witness the execution. The final walk is short, usually less than 50 feet. But for the man making it, it can feel endless. At the door to the chamber, the warden paused. "Do you have any final words?" he asked. Raymond nodded. "Tell my mama I love her." Inside, the room was cold and brightly lit. In the center stood a gurney with leather straps. A microphone hung from the ceiling. A pane of glass separated the chamber from the witness gallery. Raymond lay down without resistance. Straps were tightened across his wrists, ankles, and chest. A nurse swabbed his arm with alcohol. A thin 4-needle slid into his vein. At 5:58 p.m., the warden stepped forward and asked again, "Do you have any final statement?" Raymond turned his head toward the glass and spoke softly, "I'm sorry. I hope someday you'll forgive me." Then he closed his eyes. The warden nodded to the team. A series of syringes were pushed through the 4-line. Within seconds, Raymond's chest began to rise and fall more slowly. At 6:02 p.m., his breathing stopped. The doctor checked for a pulse. None. "Time of death," he said quietly, 6:03 p.m. Outside, the sun was setting over Huntsville. A cold wind swept across the prison yard. For Raymond, the sentence handed down 18 years earlier had finally been carried out. But for the men still locked inside their cells just down the hall, the clock continued to tick. Some had months left. Others, years. A few, decades. But every one of them knew that one day, the sound of footsteps in the hallway might come for them too. And not every execution ends the same way. In some cases, the phone does ring. In others, witnesses faint. Some inmates speak words that haunt guards for the rest of their lives. And in rare cases, the most shocking of all, death itself doesn't go as planned. There have been moments when the final injection didn't work properly, when the execution took much longer than expected, when legal appeals were filed while the inmate was already strapped to the gurney. Those moments changed everything, not just for the men on the table, but for the entire debate around the death penalty in America. And they are part of what makes death row one of the most controversial, mysterious, and haunting places in the country. The story of death row is not just about punishment. It's about time, memory, and the thin line between justice and mercy. And it's far from over. Because as one door closes, another always opens. And down the hall, another clock has already begun to tick.